let's start with you, Sara. And well, let me just a few words for introduction. And I know you very well, of course, for your monograph on Marcellus of Ancyra. So you are a bit in this city with the canons here again, but you have of course published many more articles, especially on the Trinitarian debate, on early Christian martyrs, also on women's history, on Irenaeus. So your research subject is a very broad field, and also the construction of heresy and orthodoxy. But now you want to deal with the canons of Ancyra, and please, the floor is yours. Just start.
Okay, thank you very much. Can you all hear me?
Yes, perfect.
Yes. Right, thank you. Well, thank you very much for inviting me to be part of this colloquium, which is so exciting. So I feel a bit of an amateur among all these proper linguists, but I hope you'll enjoy some of my provocative suggestions and enjoy arguing about them afterwards. So I'm calling this the Canons of Ancyra 314, a varifocal lens through which to view the Canons of Nicaea. The Canons of Ancyra are in themselves a fascinating study. In my book, Marcellus of Ancyra and the Lost Years of the Arian Controversy in 2006, I looked at them in the first chapter primarily as a way of understanding Marcellus of Ancyra's pastoral strategy, having previously demonstrated in an article that Marcellus, rather than Vitalis of Antioch, presided over the Council of Ancyra. These canons also cast considerable light on the response of the churches in Asia Minor to the Great Persecution, on the conciliar tradition of Asia Minor and how it was organized, and on the existence and dangers of shared sexual infections caused by sex with animals in early 4th century central Anatolia, which seem to have been causing some form of brain damage. That's a fascinating medical study, but it's way beyond the scope of this paper. I have further argued that the Canons of Ancyra are a response to some of the Latin tradition of the Canons of Illiberis or Elvira at the end of the 3rd century. In this paper, however, I shall be focusing on their relationship with the Canons of Nicaea as part of our series on the Canons of Nicaea themselves. My main case will be twofold. It will consider the Canons of Ancyra as a proximate inspiration for the Canons of Nicaea, on the assumption that the canonists of Nicaea had the Canons of Ancyra in front of them, or at least read to them. And it will address the transmissions of the canons of both Ancyra and Nicaea in the 4th century. In particular, I will argue that the Antioch collection of canons of 379, the fountainhead of all Eastern canon law, had nothing to do with Eusebius of Antioch, despite the case made for this by Edward Schwartz and repeated by many scholars since. Now, you'd expect me to be provocative, so that's my main piece of being provocative. That's the Parvis theory that you can all argue about. Instead, I will argue that the compilation of the Antioch collection of 379 is essentially the work of Basil of Caesarea, probably drawing on an earlier compilation put together by Basil of Ancyra in the years after the abortive Council of Sardica of 343. So the first half, the Canons of Ancyra as the primary inspiration for the Canons of Nicaea. The Canons of Nicaea are fairly closely related to 3 previous sets of conciliar canons: the Canons of Ancyra 314, the Canons of Arles 314, and the Canons of Neo-Caesarea, a council which took place sometime between Ancyra and Nicaea. Yet I want to argue that the Canons of Ancyra are handled somewhat differently at Nicaea from those of the other 2 councils. In the case of both the Canons of Arles, which are of course in Latin, and the 2 Canons of Neo-Caesarea, with which Nicaea is in intertextual conversation, I would argue that Nicaea's response is largely additional or corrective. Canon 2 of Arles, for example, gives the short ruling concerning those who were appointed ministers in various places, that they carry on ministering in the same places. This is picked up by Nicaea Canons 15 and 16. And the translation I'm using here is Norman Tanner's. On account of the great disturbance and the factions which are caused, it is decreed that the custom, if it is found to exist in some parts contrary to the canon, should be totally suppressed, so that neither bishops nor presbyters nor deacons shall transfer from city to city. If after this decision of this holy and great synod, anyone shall attempt such a thing, or shall lend himself to such a proceeding, the arrangement shall be totally annulled, and he shall be restored to the church of which he was ordained bishop or presbyter or deacon. Canon 16 reads, any presbyters or deacons, or in general anyone enrolled in the rank of the clergy who depart from their church recklessly and without fear of God before their eyes, or in ignorance of the church's canon, ought not by any means to be received in another church, but all pressure must be applied to them to induce them to return to their own diocese, or if they remain, it is right that they should be excommunicated. But if anyone dares to steal away one who belongs to another and to ordain him in his church without the consent of the other's own bishop, among whose clergy he was enrolled before he departed, the ordination is to be null. So a very long commentary on a very short canon in Arles. This is perhaps an extreme example of a canon which is deemed to need a little filling out by the legislators of Nicaea, but there are others. Arles' Canon 1213 on clergy becoming involved in usury is taken up in Nicaea Canon 17 with details as to how that usury might actually be done in practice. You might charge 50% on top of the amount that you were charged in the first place or something. Urban deacons getting above themselves and not sufficiently honouring presbyters in Arles Canon 18 prompts Nicaea Canon 18 on ways in which deacons might get above themselves also in liturgy. We can see a similar example in the case of Neo-Caesarea's Canon 5 and Nicaea's Canon 14, which is essentially a footnote to it. The Neo-Caesarean canon addresses the question of catechumens who sin and notes that they are to be degraded from the ranks of the catechumenate to the position of hearers. Neo-Caesarea's Canon 5 may itself be considered something of a correction to Ancyra Canon 12, which argues that those who sacrificed during the persecution while they were catechumens should face no lasting penalty because their sin is washed away by baptism. By the time of Neo-Caesarea, the persecution would appear to be well over. And so the point is simply an abstract one. But Neo-Caesarea is keen to make the point that there still needs to be some penalty for catechumens who sin, but it remains unspecific what that penalty should be. Nicaea's Canon 14 responds to that by specifying a period of 3 years of extra penance among the hearers. The Nicene canons, which add further detail to the canons of Neo-Caesarea and Arles, however, canons 14 to 18, come towards the end of the Nicene canons. And in particular, they come after Nicaea Canon 13, the great canon which specifies that anyone whatsoever who is dying and seeks to share in the Eucharist, the bishop, upon examining the matter, shall give him a share in the offering. Concerning those dying, the ancient canon law is still to be maintained, namely that those who are dying are not to be deprived of their last most necessary viaticum, but if one whose life has been despaired of, has been admitted to communion, and has shared in the offering, and is found to be numbered again among the living, he shall be among those who take part in the prayer only. This canon serves as a corrective to canons at both Arles and Neo-Caesarea, which had envisaged that there were circumstances in which some people were not to be accepted into communion, even on their deathbeds. Canon 14:15 and Canon 22 of Arles and Canon 2 of Neo-Caesarea all come into this category. Canon 14:15 concerns those who falsely accuse their brothers. Canon 22 envisages people who apostatize and never return to the church, nor do penance, and afterwards seek communion when they are ill. The latter are not to be given communion unless they recover and do penance. Canon 2 of Neo-Caesarea envisages a woman marrying 2 brothers who is to be excommunicated unto death. If she is in danger of death and promises to give up the reunion if she recovers, the canon sets out that she can have repentance, metanoia, without making it clear whether this includes receiving communion immediately or not. The relationship between Nicaea and these two councils, in other words, I would argue, is rather different from the relationship between Nicaea and Ancyra. As far as the order of its canons is concerned, Nicaea seems to have engaged first with a few details from the canons of Ancyra in canons 3 to 11, even though Ancyra was earlier than both Neo-Caesarea and slightly earlier than Arles. Then to have engaged with the question of reception to communion in canon 13, and then with other specific details in the canons of Neo-Caesarea and then Arles in canons 14 to 18. Nicaea does not correct or disagree with the rulings of Ancyra, as it does with those of the other councils, but simply reaffirms, engages with, or extends some of its rulings. Nicaea canon 3 picks up from the opposite direction, Ancyra canon 19, which states that we have ruled out virgins living together with some men as sisters. Nicaea's take on this is, this great synod absolutely forbids a bishop, presbyter, deacon, or any of the clergy to keep a woman who has been brought to live with him, with the exception, of course, of his mother or sister or aunt, or of any person who is above suspicion. Nicaea canon 8 on the provisions for receiving novations or cathars back into the church also picks up Ancyra canon 19, which refers to the penance for the twice married, making being twice married a normal thing. Nicaea canon 11 on those who denied the faith under Licinius without necessity picks up Ancyra's penitential schemes for the lapsed in general, including evoking the language of Ancyra canon 6 with its reference to philanthropia, even where it is not deserved. Above all, as we have already noted, Nicaea follows Ancyra's practice of always leaving room for the receptions of penitents in danger of death, first set out in Ancyra canon 6. These differences imply a key role, as I've argued before, for Marcellus of Ancyra, who attended the councils of Ancyra and Nicaea, which had also originally been called to meet at Ancyra, Council of Nicaea, but not the councils of Arles or Neo-Caesarea. I argued in Lost Years of the Arian Controversy that canons 19 to 24 of Ancyra were intended to be a corrective to some of the canons of Iliberus and Elvira on questions of murder and adultery, which were often harsh towards women in particular, excluding them, in several cases, from communion for their whole lives, even at death. Iliberus canon 63 argues that women who become pregnant while their husbands are absent and then kill the resulting child, presumably by abortion, should not receive communion even at death because they have committed 2 mortal sins at once. Ancyra canon 21 overturns this in favor of 10 years of penance. Iliberus canon 7 and 8 excluded multiple adulterers, or a woman who took to living with a man other than her husband, from communion even at death. Ancyra argued that adulterers must be accepted back into communion after 7 years penance. Ancyra specifically refers to earlier rulings in arguing for more philanthropia than they had shown. It was the self-conscious aim of the Council of Ancyra to make the penitential system work, even for particularly recalcitrant or serious sinners, and particularly to do away with some of the harsher penalties for women that can be found in other canonical legislation. I've suggested elsewhere that Marcellus was closely involved in the session at Nicaea, which drew up the canons. Much more closely, it would appear, than he was in the session which drew up the Nicene Creed, which I've argued he really had very little to do with. If Marcellus had a rival in the room which was looking at the canons at Nicaea, it would have been Osius of Cordova, who had been present at Iliberus and would be central to drawing up the canons of Sardica, which preserve his name as the relator for most of them. It is interesting to see Nicaea, to some extent, take aim at the canonical legislation of Arles, which happened just after Ancyra, as Ancyra itself had at that of Iliberus. The case that it was Marcellus who insisted on the principle of always allowing communion to those in danger of death, both at Ancyra and at Nicaea, remains attractive. So much for the theory as to the relationship between the canons of those 3 councils, and particularly Ancyra, to those of Nicaea. Here comes the Parvis theory of the assembly of the Antioch collection. The primitive transmission of the canons of Ancyra and Neo-Caesarea in all linguistic versions notes that they come after the canons of Nicaea in the collection, but that those of Nicaea stand first in the collection because they are more authoritative. It's said in slightly different ways in different translations. This is the main plank of the case for the Canons of Nicaea having been added on at the beginning of an extant collection, which did not include Nicaea before 379, which was set out by Schwarz. As I have noted elsewhere, if this had been the case, the name of Marcellus of Ancyra would have stood at the head of all the episcopal names, giving authority to the pre-existing canonical collection starting with Ancyra. And it would simply be impossible, I would argue, in either an Arian or a Homoousian collection for that to have been the case. I will argue instead that the most primitive collection was Nicaea, Ancyra, and Neo-Caesarea. This was argued by Pierre Louis in the 1970s, that it passed through the hands of Basil of Ancyra in the 340s and 350s, and was copied out and employed by him in the context of the Synod of Gangra. Furthermore, that it was he who also added the Canons of Antioch 328 to it in the context of the conciliar debates of the late 350s and early 360s. There may have been canons of other councils in the collection at this stage of a Homoousian provenance, which were later weeded out by Basil of Caesarea, or perhaps gathered together as the elusive Synod of Laodicea, whose place and time and attendees are completely unknown. In any case, the Antioch collection perfectly suited the purposes of the party of Meletius of Antioch at the Council of 379, as is widely recognized, and that of no other Antiochene party, either then or at any earlier stage. We may run through the main peculiarities of the earliest version of the collection fairly quickly, and I'm sure the linguistic experts will want to talk about this at more length. So the canons of the Synod of Antioch of 328 are out of place after the Synod of Gangra, when they should be before it. The canons of Nicaea, Ancyra, Neo-Caesarea, Gangra, and Antioch, in that order, all with episcopal signatories, thus form the heart of the collection, before the 59 canons of the Council of Laodicea were later added without any signatories or note of when the supposed synod which produced these canons was supposed to have taken place. The Greek canons only survive in systematic versions organized by topic from the 6th century onwards, but the witness of the earliest Latin and Syriac versions from as early as 419 and 410 respectively, as well as the Armenian, which diverges in various ways but clearly goes back to a similarly early date, indicates a continuously numbered collection which was widely disseminated from Antioch. From my point of view, one of the earliest and most interesting changes occurs to the list of bishops who attended Ancyra. So the name Marcellus of Ancyra, which occurs at the head of the list in the earliest Latin manuscript and also the Armenian manuscript, the name Vitalis of Antioch being listed fourth, in later manuscripts, Vitalis's name has been placed ahead of Marcellus's. As I have argued elsewhere, Vitalis, who was Bishop of Antioch for only a short time, the original Vitalis, and had no other impact on the politics of the time, is an isolated figure among a list which includes bishops from Nicomedia in Bithynia, Laodicea in Phrygia, and Pergae in Pamphylia. Only Ephesus is missing from the metropolitans of Asia Minor, significantly the most prestigious of the capitals, in a period before Nicomedia had become Licinius's imperial capital. Only 13 bishops are attested as attending Ancyra, but they are organized so as to be representative of the whole Anatolian subcontinent. The only other synod which has the kind of organizational reach implied by the bishops attending it is Nicaea itself. In addition, the 25 canons of Ancyra represent a systematic approach to a live pastoral problem, the problem of the lapsed following the end of the Great Persecution. A point worth making about the canons of Ancyra is that they are primarily interested not in exercising power, but in enabling reconciliation. Unlike many canons, for example, those of Illiberis, the legislators of Ancyra do not seek to police women harshly. The harshness of Ancyra in canons 16 and 17 seems to be reserved for men who have sex with animals. They represent, and I mean, I'm not going to talk about this today, but I think because there's obviously a contagious disease spreading, which is a danger to, women as well. They represent, for the most part, an attempt to deal systematically and equitably with an enormous social division within Christianity caused by the great but very unequal suffering brought about by the Diocletian persecution. The emphasis is on reconciliation after due public separation, and then integration according to the recognized stages, according to a clear liturgical calendar focused on Easter as the moment of liturgical forgiveness, year by year, as people are brought back into the church. This is an entirely different program from, I would argue, from the 15 canons of Neo-Caesarea, which are much less effective, despite being passed by nearly half as many bishops again, 20 instead of 13. The canons of Neo-Caesarea are unsystematic and ad hoc, mostly focused on questions concerning women and forbidden marriages of various kinds, or of clerical sins of a fairly general kind. 5 of the bishops of Ancyra seem to have attended Neo-Caesarea, although of course we don't have the names of sees at Neo-Caesarea, including Vitalis himself, Lupus of Tarsus, and the future Arian supporter Narcissus of Neronias from Cilicia, and Basil of Amasea and Heraclius of Zela from Dias Pontus. The desire to repeat the authoritative work of Ancyra is clear whenever this synod took place, but the canons do not carry the same conviction as the canons of Ancyra. You just wouldn't have kept them in if it weren't for Ancyra. In terms of the interests of the canons of these two councils, as well as the provenance of their bishops, it is difficult to imagine their being treasured apart from Nicaea by anyone except a bishop of Ancyra, Cappadocian Caesarea, or Dias Pontus. The legislation of Ancyra, while important in its own day, ceased to be of much use after the great persecution faded into memory. The legislation of Neo-Caesarea was probably never very important in its own right. The Council of Ancyra becomes, above all, a witness to the importance of the See of Ancyra after Nicaea. Given that it lacks episcopal sees, the Council of Neo-Caesarea does not witness to anything much at all, except an ongoing tradition of bishops in local synods producing canonical legislation, addressing minor questions concerning the details of the 3 mortal sins of apostasy, adultery, and murder. Regarding both the later bishops who might treasure these canons and the geographical areas which might have taken copies of them, they were, of course, both attended by a bishop of Antioch, but not one who was associated with any of the parties who later disputed control of the see, although he did share a name with a later Bishop Vitalis of Antioch, as we shall see. Neo-Caesarea was the territory of Basil of Caesarea's family and friends. Ancyra was the locus first of Marcellus's authority, and then that of his successor, Basil of Ancyra. Both Marcellus and Basil of Ancyra were keen to be recognized as leaders in the Anatolian churches, but both had to deal with the fact that although Ancyra was the main stop on the road from Antioch to Nicomedia, so it was of considerable strategic importance, it lacked prestige. It lacked the prestige of great cities like Ephesus, the political importance, after Licinius, of the Bithynian sees, and the ecclesiastical weight that Basil of Cappadocian Caesarea would later bring to that see. There is simply no reason, therefore, I would argue, for the canons of Ancyra and Neo-Caesarea to have survived on their own, or to have been circulated apart from Nicaea and its canonical program. From the very first copies of them, Ancyra and Neo-Caesarea are contextualized as coming before Nicaea but ranking after it. These canons and the bishops attached to them give consequence to the bishops of Ancyra, Caesarea, and Dias Pontus, not to the bishops of Antioch, who had plenty of consequence of their own. These canons showed that Marcellus once mattered, that the see of Ancyra mattered, that Anatolia could be united, that the church was once a well-meaning, dynamic, and united body, which governed itself intelligently and graciously in a manner fit for those who valued law and order. They also show the church as it was before Nicaea, but in continuity with Nicaea. It was, in other words, everything Basil of Caesarea longed for and was unable to find in the broken and messy ecclesiastical world of the 370s. If we take the view that the initial collection was from its earliest period, Nicaea, Ancyra, and Neo-Caesarea, as a single document, can we find a context for it? An obvious one is available: the failed ecumenical council of Sardica, which invented the idea of Nicaea as an ecumenical council, a term not used about it earlier than the early 340s. The introduction to the canons of Nicaea uses the term ecumenical council of Nicaea. Though it also speaks of the 318 fathers, a number which did not become fixed until the 370s, this is not a difficult addition to ascribe to assume the Council of 379 having made. The Canons of Nicaea would, of course, circulate separately in the West in Latin with those of Sardica, but it's clear that both sides, East and West, were trying to contextualize Nicaea in their own way in the early 340s. In 343, Constantius's regions were still playing lip service to Nicaea, even while trying to replace its creed. The Nicaea Ancyra Neo-Caesarea collection would have given consequence to Basil of Ancyra, who was one of the two main leaders of the Eastern Party at Sardica with Acacius of Palestinian Caesarea. In Basil's case alone, the involvement of Marcellus of Ancyra would not invalidate the importance of this collection, because the prestige of the See of Ancyra it showcased brought him additional authority as Marcellus's more worthy successor. Basil of Ancyra was, of course, also involved in the Synod of Gangra and in the deposition of Eustathius of Sebastia. The acts of this synod were of particular importance to the Meletian party in 379, since it underlined their case to replace the Homoiousians as the main politically viable alternative to the supporters of the Homoian Creed. But in an earlier period, immediately after the Council of Constantinople of 360, it would have bulwarked the case Basil of Ancyra and the other Homoiousians attempted to make to Julian and then Jovian against Eudoxius of Constantinople, including a claim of being ready to support Nicaea, which they believed Jovian at least wanted to do. So when were the Canons of Antioch 328 added to the collection? They could have been added by Basil of Ancyra at any time after Gangra, because he and the other Homoiousians adulated Eusebius of Caesarea, who presided over that council. But once again, that council was of even more use to Basil of Caesarea and the Meletians, because it was the council which had originally deposed Eustathius of Antioch, of whom Meletius's rival Paulinus of Antioch was the disciple. The Council of Antioch of 379 happened after Basil of Caesarea's death, but the intellectual side of the takeover of the Eastern Church, which it both represented and facilitated, was almost entirely Basil's work, joined with the strategic brilliance of Eusebius of Samosata, running around ordaining people on the quiet. The Antioch collection of canons does exactly what the theological arguments set out in Theodoret's ecclesiastical history do to prove the Nicene pedigree of the Meletian party, and outflank Meletius's rivals, Paulinus and Vitalis of Antioch, the Apollinarian choice as Bishop of Antioch. The Canons of Nicaea show that the Meletians are in the Nicene tradition, although Basil's party have agreed not to attack Marcellus by name at this stage, because Rome accepts him as Orthodox. The Canons and Bishop list of Ancyra subtly signal that the current Vitalis of Antioch is really part of the Marcellan party, Marcellus himself having died only 4 years previously. Neo-Caesarea knits Basil's Pontic circles together more closely with the Nicene tradition. The Canons of Gangra show that Eustathius of Sebastia was a heretic of long standing, and that even the Homoiousians had always thought so. The Canons of Antioch 328 show that Paulinus of Antioch is also outside the canonical tradition. So what of the claims of Eusebius? There simply is no good reason to imagine he would ever have had anything to do with the Antioch collection. He had no need of that sort of legitimacy. He was the imperially recognized Bishop of Antioch under Constantius, and then again under Valens. Julian was uninterested in canonical arguments. The canons would not have helped Eusebius in the short period of Jovian's advent. He had no known connections with Pontus or Ancyra, no need to be interested in Gangra. The later Arian apostolic constitutions tradition is a very different collection, most likely drawing mainly on Homoiousian materials. Above all, a collection which began with the Synod of Ancyra in 314 and had Marcellus of Ancyra's name at the head of its list of bishops would simply never have been treasured by Eusebius or any one of his tradition. He, of all people, was old enough to have known Marcellus at Nicaea, where Marcellus had strongly attacked Arius's party. There is simply no incentive for Eusebius to have assembled the Antioch collection, as Schwartz posited it must have been before 379. Rather, the Antiochene collection was part of Basil of Caesarea's master plan, which included a great deal of work on the Asia Minor canonical tradition, which can be seen at work in his 4 canonical letters to Amphilochius of Iconium. The Homoiousian tradition, so very synodal as it was, also had its canonical side. It is not implausible that the Canons of Laodicea are originally a Homoiousian collection. but they do not seem to have been sent out in the first batch of canons from the Council of Antioch of 379. Rather, the fountainhead of the tradition, including canons sent to Armenia, the Syriac-speaking seas, and to Africa, was a series of canons from the councils of Nicaea, Ancyra, Neo-Caesarea, Gangra, and Antioch, which implicitly proved that Meletius and his party were the heirs of Nicaea, heirs of the serene pre-Nicene United Church, and that Eustathius of Sebastaia and Paulinus of Antioch, condemned by synods led by Basil of Ancyra and Eusebius of Caesarea, were not. Let us return then to the canons of Ancyra themselves. If there ever was a golden age of the post-persecution, pre-Nicene church, a church at peace, a church of well-regulated mercy and public liturgical forgiveness, in which bishops legislated together for the good of the community with a desire to bring back those scattered by fear of the ravages of prison and torture, without being offensive to those who had actually undergone such torture. It was the church of the Council of Ancyra of 314. It was that church on whose strength Nicaea drew, and whose mercy it recommended when it laid down that anyone who genuinely wanted communion on his or her deathbed after appropriate examination should be given it. The work that Marcellus and his companions, I have posited, did to soften the harshness of Illiberis at Ancyra and again at Nicaea to do away with the ambiguities of Arles regarding forgiveness. The mercy Marcellus showed others in the youth of his life was shown to him in his middle years by Julian of Rome in the 340s, and in his old age by Athanasius and Damasus in the 370s. Even the consummate politician Basil of Caesarea, who did his best to sacrifice Marcellus's Nicene orthodoxy to the good of the Meletian cause, was outplayed by the regard in which Marcellus was held by his friends, and above all Athanasius. Since the work of Marcellus of Ancyra stands at the root of the Eastern Orthodox canonical tradition, he is well placed eventually, I hope, to be regarded as forgiven by that tradition as well. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for your rich paper and for this contextualization and combination of the different collections. Thank you very much. It was very interesting, I think, to combine this with a Nicene Trinitarian debate to integrate the collection of the canons. So we are looking forward now to this response by Geoffrey Dunn. I hope his micro is working, but we have talked already a little bit. And he's well known for his studies on ecclesiastical clergy, church liturgy, and papal letters, for example, Cyprian and the Bishop of Rome, or his edited volume, The Bishop of Rome in Late Antiquity, and articles on Augustine, and so on. Thank you for joining us here, and we are looking forward now to your response. The floor is yours.
Uta, thank you. Thank you and Samuel for inviting me to be part of this. It's a great honor for me. I do have a response which is probably a lot longer than it needs to be or that time will allow. So let me kind of, rather than read the paper, and it's full of a lot of boring, detailed comparison between different synods. We'll get to that soon enough, but I kind of start in the same position as the Parvis theory that we've just heard. And in part, Sara's trying to ask the question, partly, why the canons of this synod are preserved. And so when I have had the great privilege of sitting in the great libraries of Europe, and I call out a medieval manuscript that contains my papal decretals, I have to whip through the first 100 and something folios of synodal canons to get to my papal decretals. And again, it's always the same synods that are represented, you know, and I'm looking at the Collectio Dionysiana or the Hispana or the Kesneliana or the Avellana or various other collections along the way. And it strikes me there must have been an enormous number of these synods that met. You know, if every province had one or two every year. There's an enormous number of synods that met in several hundred years of early Christianity. Why are only a selected few preserved, let alone even mentioned? And Ancyra, therefore, occupies this exceptionally privileged position. And so someone has decided to keep these canons, and we've heard part of this, the Parvis theory about why that might be. And so it was something that occupied my thinking as I came to this. And my theory is probably nowhere near as sophisticated as the one we just heard, and gets bogged down very quickly in the placing the canons of this synod into a context of comparison with other synods. And if we take the first 9 canons of Ancyra that deal with the response to the Great Persecution, 1/3 roughly of the canons of this synod mark an end point. They don't have an ongoing influence. There's a brief mention at Nicaea, but they mark an end point, because this is the last time, in a sense, that the church needs to respond to the threat or to the pressure that persecution brings to its members. So if we want to look at those first 9 canons, we need to look backwards to what had influenced it, in a sense. And for me, the best place to look there is to the Africans, and to the mid-3rd century with Cyprian, the man I know fairly well, and to see, although we don't have the canons of his earliest synods, 251, 252, 253, that begin to look at this, we again see a church responding to the impact of let's call it persecution, rather than have to explain what I think was really going on in Carthage or in the empire at that stage. And to see, yes, people who lapse, people who collaborate with the enemy, if you like, by offering sacrifice or by paying their way out of it, out of the church membership, and need to find a way back in. And that creates problems in the African and the Roman communities, and further afield, with those who are extremely strict and say there cannot be forgiveness, those who are more or even extremely lax and say forgiveness must be much more readily available. Cyprian steers that ultimately that middle way. And the pressures over time, the 253 pestilence that visits the empire, and the threat perhaps of further persecution, means he has to soften his position even further to maintain his control over his community and the support that they offer him. That's what we need to compare with Ancyra and its 9 canons. What I think we see is that to see Ancyra then as this end point of that life of persecution is to see a more detailed response than what we find 60 years earlier under Cyprian. And as Sara has noticed, it's a touch more lenient. And we see and Sara saying, okay, clerics who have participated in sacrifice are able to maintain their clerical status, but not able to exercise any of the functions of their office. Whereas, therefore, the position, even as Cyprian is trying to meander his way between the two extremes, he doesn't come to that conclusion, nor does Rome under Cornelius, for that matter, come to that conclusion that you can you can maintain your status, but be deprived of activity as a minister of the church. Lay people physically forced to deny the faith against their will. Ancyra says they're not responsible for their lapse. They could later be ordained if they so sought, Canon 3. So we see in Ancyra this more lenient, more willingness to discriminate between the intentions, try to get behind the psychology, if you like, of why people lapse or sin or participate in idolatry the way that they do. And therefore to create a whole wider range of categories into which to place people. And to offer, therefore, more paths of reconciliation back. And we see the detail there of, for 1 year, you will be amongst the audientes, 3 years among the substrati, 2 years back as a member of the church, but not able to communicate. There are all these steps, and there are different paths, and Sara offers more. But that's the first, 9 canons of Ancyra, marking an end point. And because of the change in circumstance, we don't see it having much influence in later centuries. A different story with the rest of the canons. They mark a position along a long trajectory of dealing with certain issues. And we see things, and there are various ways of categorizing what happens or what's discussed at Ancyra. A clerical lifestyle. So many synods, that seems to be the big issue. And, it's not surprising. Clerics are always the bane of their bishops' lives. Church would be so much better without them, really. But we've got them, we've got to deal with them. Clerical lifestyle, marriage, virginity, the country bishops, I like to call them, the core episcopi. And we've heard mention already the problem or the particular issue that makes Ancyra quite unique, dealing with bestiality, episcopal election, murder, fortune tellers. There's a whole range of these kind of pastoral issues that need to be dealt with, these problems that need to be addressed. And as soon as you get into one of these little topics that the canon brings up, this is just the delight of getting into the scholarship. You suddenly come up against, or have to deal with, at least in some ways, the perspectives, let's say, the agenda even, of scholars who come to it not as canonists, but looking at all kinds of other angles that are happening here. So if we look at the clerical lifestyle, then we get into, and clerical marriage within that lifestyle. Looking at the canons at Ancyra, suddenly you're dealing with a whole lot of scholars who have an axe to grind, if you like, about clerical celibacy or not, and wanting to find a way to argue their point of view. So we see at Ancyra, provision is made for a deacon, unmarried at the time of ordination, but who enters into marriage subsequently. So the bishops at Ancyra say, okay, those who announced at the time of their appointment that they needed to marry, that's one category. Those who didn't make any announcement but go on to marry anyway, that's another category. The first category we can deal with. They obviously had their bishop's permission. Their marriage doesn't impede their diaconal ministry. The second group, because they've gone back on a promise, they're to be removed from ministry. But then the question is, with this first group, is the marriage taking place before or after their ordination? And there's a backwards and forwards, and it becomes just, a really interesting topic to try and sort your way through, because the canon itself is not explicit. There's a whole lot of other stuff that needs to go on there to look at that. And so we see here, like for that one, that Canon 10 at Ancyra, it has a life afterwards. And we've heard some of that in the previous paper, its impact, its affirmation at Nicaea, and the possible link between the two through Marcellus. But again, we can see, okay, if we look at Iliberis, Elvira, Canon 33 could be one for comparison with Canon 10 of Ancyra. But that's, of course, if we've got to deal then with the question, is Canon 33 actually from that synod, or is it a later edition? Nicaea has nothing to say in its canons really about clerical marriage, specifically apart from Canon 3 about cohabitation of clerics. Serdica, again, doesn't have anything to say about clerical marriage. Yet we do know that clerical marriage and clerical sexual continence within marriage were subjects of increasing concern to bishops gathered in synods across the provinces of the empire. And that becomes an increasing thing as we move from the 4th century then into the 5th. Space just doesn't permit time to look at that. It's a huge topic. Other canons at Ancyra that concern clerics, Canon 14, again, a peculiarly little interesting one. Presbyters and deacons ought to taste meat, even if they don't consume it. Those who displayed an extreme aversion to meat products contaminating other food were to be dismissed from the clergy. You know, this is the kind of thing you could imagine becoming a social media headline, you know, no vegans among the clergy. It's probably a Manichaean issue, but we don't have much of a context provided. But no other canon from any other synod deals with that issue. Church goods sold by presbyters is a canon from Canon 15, canon from Ancyra that gets picked up at the 338 synod of Antioch, which we used to think was the 341 synod of Antioch, but let's say it's 338. And we see that synod at Antioch does pick up a lot of points from the synod of Ancyra, again suggesting, you know, that either the link from the Bishop of Antioch or Marcellus or somebody like that. Abducted engaged females was dealt with at Ancyra, Canon 11. And they say that they must be returned to their betrothed if they've been abducted. Again, it's something we don't find, it doesn't get picked up at Arles or at Neo-Caesarea or at Nicaea. So we see some of these canons have a life afterwards. Some of them perhaps reflect a particular local issue. And seeing the afterlife of a canon or seeing threads that run through the synodal tradition can help us in a way to identify which of these matters are particularly of local interest, which are of universal interest, which are persistent issues. We've heard about the provision of Canon 20 with the punishment of adulterous married women. The canon specifies punishment only for a man, working on the presumption that the woman would have been forced into it. Although other commentators have seen the canon's punishment as applying to men and women equally. There's debate amongst those who read this canon. And again, as Sara noted, that Ancyra always leaves, no matter what sort of punishment, it always leaves that door for reconciliation in danger of death open. The country bishops, the core episcopoi, the problem that they seem to have created, Ancyra deals with it. Nicaea picks this up in discussing the Novatianists in Canon 8 of Nicaea, and it allows several options for integrating repentant Novatianist bishops back into the mainstream church. And one of their options is to turn these Novatianist bishops into country bishops, or to turn them into what we might call jurisdictionless bishops, where there was already a Nicene bishop or a mainstream bishop. That is one that gets picked up on. Serdica, areas where a presbyter would suffice, there shouldn't be a country bishop. So this is an ongoing and universal problem, let's say. And so we can see the way that Ancyra treats it, we can compare it with the way other synods treat it, and we can get a sense of its leniency or its strictness, and we can get a sense of what issues are local and peculiar to an area and to a time, and what aren't. Let's skip over the two canons on bestiality. Episcopal election is always a fascinating topic. Canon 18 deals with bishops elected to a church that wouldn't accept them. The concern was that they would go to other churches and be a nuisance there. And so the punishment for that was excommunication. The solution was that they could live as presbyters in the church from which they came, keeping their dignity. Now, maybe the Greek is clearer than I see it as, but keeping what dignity? I presume it means their episcopal dignity. So again, they're going to be given the honor of being bishop, but deprived of any actual episcopal authority. This seems to be their solution, the solution they had adopted earlier. They adopt here as well. And that's, of course, related to the thorny issue of the translation of clergy. We see the same year, 314, at Arles, 2 canons issued prohibiting clergy from transferring from one church to another, and an extra canon forbidding the undermining of the reputation of a colleague. So Nicaea forbids the practice as contrary to the rule. And I think when Nicaea says this, what's that, Canons 15 and 16? When Nicaea says this as contrary to the rule, perhaps that rule could be a reference to Canon 18 of Ancyra. Yet what we see at Nicaea is much broader in scope than what Ancyra is discussing. So again, Nicaea is clarifying and sort of filling in the gaps, if you like. We know, of course, that not all translations were frowned upon. Some were quite acceptable, especially those where the request came from the local church, and some are not acceptable, especially where the attempt is the initiative of the bishop himself. And again, we see Antioch in 338 picking up on Ancyra. So the strongest impact, the strongest influence of Ancyra is in the 338 Synod of Antioch. But it has its repercussions and its similarities. Let's just say similarities, because it's happening at the same time in Arles, and I doubt that I just, as a matter of principle, just doubt that there's much crossover between Arles and Sara in the same year. Who knows? But it does have an impact at Serdica in 343. Murder, again, the slightly more lenient treatment of reconciling murderers. And fortune tellers, again, fortune tellers doesn't have an echo in other synods that I've looked at for this. So perhaps is this a sign this was a more localized problem to Anatolia? So there's no doubt that Ancyra responded to issues that were current and relevant to the situation that existed in Asia Minor at the start of the 4th century, particularly with regard to the aftermath of persecution. This would not be a situation that later synods needed to address apart from Nicaea. And so Ancyra's provisions on this topic did not have later impact. In contrast with earlier ecclesiastical pronouncements about how to respond to the failure of Christians, Ancyra's requirements were more lenient and more nuanced than what we find some 60 years earlier in the African response to persecution. And the same is true with regard to Ancyra's modifications of what was determined at Iliberis, Elvira. The canons on bestiality, the anti-Manichaean canon against extreme clerical vegetarianism, canons on murder and fortune tellers, and the last canon about a man and 2 sisters were not repeated in other later synods. Other topics, like various aspects of clerical lifestyle and appointment, and topics of sexuality and marriage that affected Christians more broadly, were a common feature of most synods. Ancyra offered paths to reconciliation for those who failed to meet the expected moral standards. And given that this is now in place, later synods, including the Great Council at Nicaea, had to pick up and somehow respond to what Ancyra had laid down. And as we heard in the previous paper, the fact that Ancyra gets incorporated into the collection of Antioch and then into these other later great collections that pass down century after century means that it's known and it has to be responded to. So Ancyra is an important synod for us. It's an important background to what is our main game here today, which is Nicaea. It enables us, looking at Ancyra and looking at synods comparatively, enables us to appreciate the extent to which problems were unique to a time and place or shared across the Christian world, perhaps as ever-present reminders of human weakness. Ancyra appears to respond very much to its own time and place, and with a particular pastoral sensitivity to human frailty. And without then going into all the rest of the tedious detail that I have, that's enough for me. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for your response and for your own insights and detailed remarks on special issues of the canons. So, well, I want to give over to Sara Parvis. Are you interested in commenting and reacting directly now to open the discussion?
Do you want to discuss this first, or do you want to do the Complani and
no, it's perhaps better now to make a round of discussion first.
I mean, I should pay tribute to Geoffrey Dunn, who only saw my paper kind of in the middle of the night. But yeah, we could talk about these things. I mean, every single one of the Ancyran canons is really interesting. I once gave a paper on this entitled "Best." You know the book, Samuel Leafley's Power and Sexuality, the Canons of Elvira. So I once gave a title in Vegetarianism and Bestiality, the Canons of Ancyra. Yeah, there's so many interesting things going on in all of that, but I do think it's well, it'd be very interesting to get into the nitty-gritty of the questions of how the collection actually built up. But I think Ancyra does have a case to be can make the case to be more important than your average local synod. I mean, it's not a local synod; it's a synod that that self-consciously wants to be a synod for the whole of Anatolia. And the other point, I mean, that Geoffrey started with, which is enormously important, the connection, that the response going back really to Cyprian, I think that's absolutely right, that this is all still engaging with Cyprian. Just a very small note on the question of Arles. Arles is after Ancyra, and I don't think either of them was responding to each other at the time. I mean, Ancyra is normally assumed to be in Easter in 314, and then Arles was in the summer. But I think Nicaea was responding to Arles in a very interesting parallel to the way that Ancyra was responding to Eliberis. What Osius of Cordova's role in all of this was, I would love to know, and certainly the fact that Sardica brings back in the idea of excommunicating people on their deathbed is very interesting, I think. But I mean, you wonder how Osius and Marcellus actually got on. But yeah, thank you very much. All of that is really interesting, and I look forward to hearing what the various experts have to say on it all, and new thoughts and revitalization of old thoughts. Thank you.
So are there further remarks, comments? Don't hesitate to raise your hand, please, and go in. Yeah, please, Mante Ostermann, please, just unmute yourself.
Hello, do you hear me? Yes, thank you very much for both conferences, which I enjoyed very much. I think both of them raise kind of a methodological question, how we approach those canons. Are they to be seen as universal or systematic code, which approach the whole pack of questions which can be raised in one church or community or the universal church? Or are they rather kind of response to local questions, local problems? It's just a general question for reflection, I think, for myself, but I'm also giving it to the audience. And then second question, well, more particular, is about the Council of Elvira, because it's a historicity of its canons. It's kind of a question. It's a problematic, and especially Josep Vilela has published a lot about it. So I think it can be also nuanced, the response to kind of one council in the East to the canons of Elvira in the Latin world. Thank you.
Yeah, is someone who wants to respond, or shall I just give over to Alberto Camplani and he answers the question?
I suspect you'll have another one. If I could just say in response to that, the question of, I mean, I think one of the really interesting things about Marcellus is that he does seem to be engaging with the West and does all the way along. I mean, just because his name is Latin doesn't mean he was Latin, but it's a possibility. I think as regards Elvira, yes, I certainly take the point that it's been cogently argued that it can't just be one council, but I think there's still some parts of it that are clearly original and genuine. As regards Ancyra, as I would say again, I do think it's more than just a local council. It's trying to make universal legislation for a problem that was Anatolia wide. And although it has a number of canons which are very local, it has others, I think, which can claim to be more universal.
Alberto Camplani, let's take a test about your micro.
Yeah. just to check the audio. Now
Yeah, welcome.
Sorry for before. About Sarah's paper. My problem is only about the list of bishops. If I would like to know more about the variant readings concerning bishops in all the translations, and if there is the possibility to think that certain deletion were done in the course of time, and when. I know that this is a very difficult question, but it is worth of mentioning it. Thank you.
I mean, that's right. You have the one Latin, the Isidora Antiqua in some of the manuscripts has Marcellus at the top, and you have the Armenian, and everything else Marcellus at the top. Are you arguing that really that my theory doesn't work on the basis of the Syriac?
No, my problem is that if there are variants about the names, if the deletion of these names can be dated at a certain moment of the transmission of the canon. So, what is your opinion about this?
My opinion is that the 379 council must have sent out the version that had Marcellus at the top, and that I think there was another set of canons sent out from Constantinople 382. And that must have been very quickly and had Laodicea added, and that must have disseminated very quickly. I mean, this is a bit speculative, but I think you had two versions of the Antioch 379 canon sent out, one in 379, and then very quickly another one in 382, and so and that becomes the one that everybody uses, the one that becomes the basis of the Syriac. But I mean, you know all this much better than I do.
If there is no further question, let me just jump in and ask a more broad question. You both presented something like a spirit of the councils, of the canons of the different councils, especially for Ancyra, which opened the door for reconciliation and which is interpreted then by you as an inspiration for Nicaea. So what is the, so to say, the spirit of reconciliation if in Nicaea, if one takes together the decisions about the Meletians in Egypt? So this is also a special question of reconciliation and how to deal with them. And we have also there a decision where you could describe this as harsh or not harsh. I think it has also a door open for reconciliation with the Meletians, although the decision by the Meletians was not so accepted, as we know. How would you like to interpret this and combine this? Because there we have more than just a short canon, but we have a letter and we have a history of the Meletians in Egypt.
It's very interesting, isn't it? Because the canons talk about the innovations, but to some extent it's then the same ruling that's extended to the Meletians. I wonder if that was just a unilateral decision of Constantine, but don't know if anyone else has any views on that.
As a more general response to that question, Uta, I'd say that's one of the things I kind of wanted to stress in a sense in this, is to know if something is lenient or harsh, we need a point of comparison. So it's either one we introduce ourselves as what we would think is, oh, this is from our modern perspective, this is harsh or this is lenient. But the comparative work here across synods within a century or within even a generation of each other gives me a firmer anchor, I think, to say, look, we can see the same issue dealt with in 4 synods. This one has a lengthier penalty imposed. This one has a shorter one. It's that then you have a comparison. So, you know, yeah. So what the comparison is for Nicaea on that particular point, is there something similar elsewhere that we can compare it with, would be the question I would want to see answered.
Alberto Clamplani, do you have an opinion on this topic?
Yes, I have a lot of doubts about the letter about the militians, and yes, I will discuss those in a moment. So only to say that there is a very strong case against the authenticity of the letter of the Nicene bishops to the Church of Alexandria, but I have some doubts about Pietra's theory that I will announce in a moment. So if you for the problem of connection and reconciliation of Novatians and the Meletians, I think that the things are from a little reading of the text a little different, but can be compared. But there are some differences between the two cases. Also, from the point of view of the acceptance of the bishops inside the Catholic Church. But I will discuss a little this problem later.
Are there further questions, remarks? Samuel, please just unmute yourself.
Yes. Oh, yes. Thank you so much for the two speakers. I wanted just to highlight an aspect of the canons and to hear from Sara or Geoffrey, and it's about the difference between Anatolia and Egypt, about the authority of the bishops. Because, for example, in Egypt, we have a bishop of Alexandria without counterbalance of power. Instead, here we in these canons we have many statements which give the bishop the authority in their own regions and so on. And then it is interesting to see how the different structure of the church in different regions shape also the authority of the bishops.
Yes, I think it's really interesting to compare particularly Anatolia and North Africa, which are the two most developed canonical, well, and Rome, the three most developed canonical traditions, because although you don't have synodal lists for early, you know about synods that happened in the 3rd century, synods that happened in the 2nd century in Asia Minor, and of course, particularly the original Roman province of Asia, you have all these cities that are very used to rivalries and to working together. So there's a sort of the organization of Anatolia and the Roman cities in Anatolia is kind of geared towards, if you like, a certain equality, a certain synodality, if you like, in a way that a lot of the rest of the Roman Empire at this point isn't yet. But the big difference is still North Africa. You always know how many bishops you should have at a North African synod, right from the beginning. You know, you have around 100, and you also at this period know how many you should have in an Egyptian synod. You don't know how many you should have at an an Anatolian synod, because it depends where you draw your boundaries. So I think that has its effect on the authority and on the question of who's actually governing what's going on in Anatolia. And as the 4th century goes on, you just get these little pockets. So you get the Homoiousians having their synods at Lampsacus and various other places. You have the you have Basil of Caesarea and the Meletians having their synods. You have all these kind of rival synods going on underground, which are mostly illegal, and even trying to get synods together with people from Rome. whereas it's partly, you can play fast and loose like that, I think, partly in Anatolia, because you don't have clear structures in the way you have in Africa, well, either in Egypt or in North Africa. I don't know if that's helpful, but it's just something I think is interesting.
Thank you.
And if I'm right, the structures are somewhat different. The bishop in Alexandria is the only metropolitan. The bishops at Ancyra, most of them are metropolitans themselves. So it's metropolitans talking to each other. Africa is different yet again. It's not too often that the primate in Numidia and the primate in Carthage are at the same synod, although they may have coordinated synods at times. It does happen occasionally, but each of them has a slightly different way of dealing with things. Cyprian is certainly conscious to be respectful of the independence of each, although he recognizes even an individual bishop's right to do his own thing, but in such a way that he wouldn't dare do it. But yeah, Egypt is a remarkably, seems to me, as a non-Egyptian specialist, a very different kind of setup. The Bishop of Alexandria, yeah, is a law unto himself, it just seems, anyway, for what that's worth.
I have a question. I would like to ask something about Canon 19, because in the second part I'm reading now, and moreover, we prohibit women who are virgins from living with the men as sisters. I see a reference to adelphopoiesis, and for example, we have a source belonging to the 16th century that Albanians in Sicily, there was adelphopoiesis between women and men. And I would like to ask whether it's correct to see in this canon a reference to adelphopoiesis. And then a second question, the canon says, if any persons who profess virginity shall disregard their profession, let them fulfill the term of the digamists. Do they mean by digamist people who marry for the second time? How do you understand it? Thank you.
Yes, I would understand that as marrying for the second time after your first spouse has died, which of course Novatians didn't allow. On the question of adelphopoiesis, yes, I think that probably is what's envisaged there. And that's something that you seem to have going on among some of the early communities, the early 4th century communities in Arian circles as well. I don't know, other people might have more specific knowledge on that.
Okay, are there further questions? Otherwise, I would just recommend 5-6 minutes, a little break, just to fetch a coffee or open the window or whatever, stand up, make some gymnastics. And we meet again for the second part, which is actually the original first part, and in 5 minutes. See you again.